Members, the question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
The Reverend Dr. David Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labor opposes the ratification of the TPP, and we do this with good reason. The first Labor government in 1938 pushed for increased market access in the UK, and Labor governments throughout New Zealand history have pushed for increased access. It was not easy or simple for us to get to a position where we would oppose a trade agreement. It had to be bad. And we had to have a principled discussion, and when we did, we realised that the TPP is not something that this Labor Party can sign up to. And Mr. Speaker, I think that that makes our opposition to this bill all the more significant. This government is trying to push through a bill that is inadequate. It is not serving New Zealand's long-term interests as it should. The opportunity was there to negotiate a trade agreement that really would be in New Zealand's long-term interests, and it has sailed by. The Minister who just spoke was not prepared to address the issue of non-resident foreign speculators in any depth. In fact, I asked him a question in the House just before during question time, which related to the EY advice on the tax at the border on foreign speculators, which this government has touted as the solution to the problems in our housing market. And the Minister admitted he had not even read that advice. This is the government's answer to the housing crisis and the speculation from non-resident foreign buyers. It has been ripped to pieces, and the Minister has not even done us the courtesy of reading that advice. The reason that the Labor Party in government will reject non-resident foreign buyers in our market, those speculators, the reason we will place a ban on them is because they are creating a distortion. It is a huge distortion to our economy, that investment in the non-productive, speculative housing sector. The government said, well, it's fine. Minister Grosser didn't ask for that, like Vietnam did. Minister Grosser didn't ask for that like Australia did. Minister Grosser didn't ask for that like other countries did, because New Zealand doesn't need to ban non-resident foreign speculators. Nothing to see here. Mr. Grosser knows better than everyone else. He said, I'll ask for a tax instead. Well, the tax experts say you cannot impose at the border a discriminatory tax on foreign speculators. This is the government's answer, and it has been ripped to shreds by the experts. They say if a tax was imposed, it would have to be imposed on New Zealand citizens just as well as everyone else. So, Mr. Speaker, they have failed to stand up for New Zealanders' long-term interests, and they seem not to care. The housing market continues to grow as a bubble, and that is hurtful to New Zealand's long-term interests, and they know it. That's why their heads are down opposite. That's why they are not proud of this deal that they are doing, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I think it's also important to point out that this is a government that has pushed through a process without respecting New Zealanders' objections to it. At every point, they have rushed the process. We had set up an opportunity for people to submit on the treaty process that preceded this bill. This bill enacts that treaty. It's necessary for the enacting of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we curtailed the process so that the government could rush this through before Christmas, because it didn't want this legislation to rush into election year. They know it's not possible, it's not popular with the public. They know they should have consulted fully. They know they should have given the public a decent opportunity to consider fully the 6,000 pages of this agreement, which were negotiated in secret over 5 years, so that they could make full representations before the committee. And they also know that they should have given members of the committee longer to come to a view on all of those submissions, and also the departmental officials that advise us, Mr. Speaker. So we know this agreement could have been so much better. It could have been negotiated in New Zealand's long-term interests in a way that didn't break the bipartisan consensus that has existed for so long. Labor continues to be a party that supports free trade. That is in our DNA. We believe in the value of trade. We are a small trading nation. I don't want to give up coffee. I don't want to give up bananas. But I do not want to sign up to a deal that harms New Zealand's long-term interests. And we have to say that the economic analysis on this deal has been incredibly poor. We know that in the end, the equivalent access gained for dairy is about 3 large dairy farms for New Zealanders by 2030. That's about 9 jobs that dairy deal creates. And at what price? At what price for New Zealand? This is not the deal it should be. New Zealanders' interests should be at the fore, not the interests of appeasing the American negotiators, not the interests of anyone in the corporate sector above ordinary middle New Zealand, Mr. Speaker. But this lot, they are out of touch. They are now so arrogant that they think they can push this through and nobody will notice. Well, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that the public of New Zealand is noticing that this is going through without full consultation processes. The public of New Zealand is noticing this increasing trend from the government to try and do quick deals. We saw it just yesterday with this Saudi sheep scandal report coming back from the Auditor General, this payment that was made that was declared not to be a facilitation payment because facilitation payments are only small payments, Mr. Speaker. We've seen a government that is willing to do deals that do not appear to be in New Zealand's long-term interest. Labor has adopted a principled position. We've examined in detail the treaty before we took our position. It hasn't always been easy publicly to say we're going to actually read it before we take a view, but that's what we've done. And when we've examined the detail, we've seen that this deal could have been so much better for New Zealand, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank those New Zealanders who have raised the profile of this issue, who have made sure there has been a public debate on it, and we saw some of them marching to Parliament today, walking all the way from Christchurch. And I take my hat off to them for their service to democracy in raising this issue into the public sphere, Mr. Speaker. I think the members opposite will try to argue that this is a defensive piece of legislation. Now they'll try and say it's about preserving access or something else. They've given up on arguing that it's actually in our long-term interest. And that's because the economic modelling that the government put forward said about, that it creates less than 1% benefit by 2030. Mr. Speaker, and that is actually quite a bold estimate, given that most of those dairy things that they were counting on in their economic analysis are no longer in the deal. Business as usual would generate a 47% increase in GDP if we did not sign the agreement. So we're talking about the margin of error here. Everything that New Zealand is giving up when it signs this deal is to get less than 1% increase in GDP in decades' time, Mr. Speaker. That cannot be a good deal in New Zealand's long-term interests. The Tufts University analysis, the only decent analysis available about employment prospects, says that this may well cost New Zealand 6,000 jobs by 2025 as a direct consequence. Well, Mr. Speaker, if that's the case, you want to have a big boost to your economy. You want to have some money that you can spread around to retrain people and so on. But with this infinitesimal boost that's in the margin of error, we can't be confident that there'll be anything at all, and we're talking about 6,000 jobs potentially lost. We're also talking about harm to the Farm Act model. We're talking about the public health analysis, impacts that could result from the TPP deal. Mr. Speaker, we heard from submitters on that, and submitters called for independent analysis of these things, employment impacts, public health impacts and so on. Very reasonable requests. That was in the prior process, Mr. Speaker. There's been plenty of opportunity for the government to analyse those things ahead of this legislation going through, and they have not lifted a finger. They are so confident about ramming this through before Christmas, before election year, that they have not looked at the detail of this agreement, and they've refused to be transparent with the public. Well, it's consistent at least. We're still seeing them hiding so much about that Saudi sheep deal. They say it's not in the public interest to see the legal advice. Well, we've pretty much seen there is nothing. The Auditor General's seen what there is, and she says she can really make nothing of it, Mr. Speaker. It's consistent, at least, from the government. They're so out of touch, so arrogant, they think they can push this through and New Zealanders won't care. Well, there is a rising tide calling for change, Mr. Speaker. There is a rising tide that says we need a government that's going to be transparent and that's going to look to everyone's interests. Previous trade agreements have been negotiated with input from business community, from unions, from academics. Mr. Gross has said, I don't need any of that. I know the answers. Don't tell me. I don't even need to know the questions. I know the answers. And I bet no one will get up and say that that was the optimal approach. No one from the opposite side will get up and say that the approach taken to negotiating this deal was optimal. And I think the outcome has been that New Zealand has got a poorer deal than it should have. We cannot support this deal, Mr Speaker. We do not see that it is in the long-term interests of New Zealand. It is not the deal it should be, and so Labor will not support this bill going through the House.
Good.